Well, mahalo, aloha kakayaka. I'm gonna jump over all the mahalos, and I do have many of them, but Miley said it so well. Aloha kako, I am Nohelani Teves. I am a tan-ish femme presenting cis wahine in her early 40s. I'm coming to you live from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. I'm actually in my office. Behind me is a file cabinet and many ruffled papers and books. I want to just make kind of like two critical points, and maybe we could talk about it later. One is that we need to queer our thinking about Pacific Island diaspora, and I'll talk about what that means. And number two, we need to be critical of always correlating non-heteronormative Pacific gender and sexualities within the Western framework of LGBTQ. So before today, I was thinking a lot about what I was going to say, and I thought I would just start by saying a little bit about how I came to this place of research and thinking. So I grew up in Hawaii my entire life until I was about 25 when I left to go to Michigan for graduate school. And it was there that I actually learned how important my queerness was. And I was gay for a very long time, but it was there where I learned how linked my queerness was to my indigeneity and how they co-created one another. And I came to this realization by making community with Pacific Islanders and Native Americans who were also sort of queer in some way. And if it were not for these relationships, I wouldn't have come to understand how linked queerness is with indigeneity as a kind of mobility with really deep mana, even when living in the diaspora. So something that I want to emphasize is that these relationships that we create in diaspora as Pacific Islanders, and I am back home now, but I still feel myself in a kind of diaspora, we have to understand that these relationships are just matter profoundly for Pacific Islander diasporic indigeneity wherever we are. So like a few years ago, I began to think about how Pacific Islander indigeneity is constrained by discourses that always privilege Native presences on the land, in contrast to living in diaspora. And these privileges impact how we belong and see one another. Now, in the Hawaiian context, there's huge emphasis, of course, especially now, on economic dislocation. But I really want us to think about how deep our Indigenous histories are to movement and travel. So how frequently we've traveled, and that we can intellectually travel as well. And that within Pacific Island studies, I think we have to engage queer of color critique and queer Indigenous studies more. Because when we queer our understanding of diaspora, we question the underlying logic that attaches Native people only to land. And we also, more importantly, question the perceived normalcy of heteropatriarchal nationalism. This allows us to refuse a perceived heterosexuality of our ancestors and recall and create different kinds of belonging that extend beyond filial or biological blood relationships. And we have many examples of this throughout our communities, I believe. Native feminists have talked about this, such as Miley Arvin, who is here, Kehaulani Kauinua. They've taught us and talked about how Pacific Islander women, and in this specific case, Hawaiian women, are always pressured to reproduce with Native men to strengthen our bloodlines and rebuild our communities. And this is a problematic emphasis, right? Most recently, Heoli Osorio has critiqued how traditional notions of the Hawaiian nation and patriotism actually uncritically replicate the heteronormativity and exclusionary violences of the settler state. Further, if we want to think about different kinds of critical pedagogies, we should all recall that, our godmother, Haunani K. Trask, wrote about being slyly reproductive too, right? Noting that poetry, writing, and activism are all ways that we can put forth mana for future generations. that don't rely on heterosexual biological reproduction. So, and then alongside this querying and thinking and talking about diaspora, we also, as I was explaining for my own experience, we have to connect with the native nations in which we were living. In this way, our diaspora can come together to recreate Indigenous life and share it, honoring our homelands, but also honoring a new place that doesn't displace the nations of the places that we're in, but instead allows us to create more expansive and dynamic forms of Indigenous belonging that themselves can become queer. And I believe by making connections with Native nations, this allows us to feel more connected to our homelands or our senses of Pacific Islander indigeneity. This then also refuses the idea that we're disconnected completely from our communities, from our homelands. It refuses heteropatry that wants to negate the different relations we're creating. And it breaks up the colonial mindset that we're somehow incomplete as islanders if we're not at home. So in this way, it kind of breaks us out of always emphasizing return narratives and allows us instead to think about the multiple roots and roots that we use to foster our indigeneity. So when we think about queerness in the Pacific diaspora, then it gives us actually an opportunity to rethink what we want Pacific culture to look like, rather than always worrying about that it doesn't look the way that it used to. And to my second point is that we all know, Pacific Islanders know, that we have lots of forms of gender and relationships, sexual relationships that precede and will exceed the state and colonial power. But solely relying on these forms of relations to authenticate our current identities or formations that we might take up is not the only way to kind of pursue our freedom, and, to kind of put it plainly. We should open up and focus on the different ways that we can be and relate with one another consensually, and not only need a pre-colonial evidence to validate us today. Although those relations certainly are sources of great pride and fight against all the violence of colonization and Christianization. So I'm not trying to invalidate the roles of the Mahu, the Fa'afafine, the Takatapui, the Fakalaiti, but I'm calling for kind of like an expansion of these histories to consider how we, what kinds of relations we actually want to have, maybe relationships that don't even have names yet, right? So I believe this is necessary to imagine queer Islander genealogies that extend across place and time. I don't think we need to rely on truth or proof of evidence that we always existed. I think we always do. For me, I always return to the brilliance of Teresia Teewa, the way she talked about the Native as being fluid and complex and not absolutely bounded. I think we need to bring queer studies into the way that we think about how her work was so powerful as well. As Native feminists remind us, the sovereignty that we have over our bodies and over our communities starts in the home. And so in that home, we are just everyday things that we do can kind of open up our thinking and the way that we talk about diaspora. We need to look to the margins, to the edges of the ocean, to affirm that queer islanders exist or might exist in different ways that we're not ready for. I think the future generation is showing us a lot of exciting things, and we have to be open to them and let them be, you know what I'm saying? And that we need to let them have space to tell their stories, and we have to also tell different stories. We can't tell all of them, obviously, but I believe that when we acknowledge our varied histories of movement, we can reimagine what kind of futures we want for ourselves in the home, or in the homeland, or in the diaspora. And I think that's my time.